Welcome everyone. My name is Simba Makahamadze. I'm the principal consultant for Palladium IP Consultants, which is an intellectual property firm that focuses on providing different intellectual property services here in the Middle East and in the region, and of course in Africa. So in terms of our services, we help our clients from the creation of intellectual property, the protection of intellectual property, the management, and of course the commercialization of intellectual property, where we then look at how to make dollars and cents out of our intellectual property. So I've been in this field for more than 12 years now, both in Africa and in the Middle East. And today we are going to look at various intellectual property issues from a business point of view, and how businesses can protect different forms of intellectual property, how they can manage and of course commercialize the intellectual property. So in view of time, what we are going to do before I share my screen, I'll share my screen and go through the presentation while Joel will assist us in terms of getting any questions for then answering at the towards the end of the session. So I'll share my screen and get right into it. All right, there we go. So usually when I do my my presentations, I always want to start with this very popular quote from Mark Getty, the co-founder of Getty Images. I'm sure the audience is quite aware of this guy. He refers to intellectual property as the oil of the 21st century, where he makes a comparison of how rich men some years ago would make money in terms of extracting natural resources, and the change that has happened with intellectual property, where the richest players in the world, be it individuals or corporates, are making their money out of intellectual property. So technically it is a innovation, and of course that IP that comes out of the innovation that is driving the world in the 21st century. So to bring it into perspective, I've just created this slide, to show the value that lies in the leading brands in the world, and the value that is driven by intellectual property. So if we look, for example, Apple, which is leading, and this is according to Brand Finance, this year in 2021, we're looking at 263 billion. And if we are going to make reference to that, quote by Mark Getty, these figures and values lie in intellectual property. They do not lie in land, they do not lie in buildings, they do not lie in tangible assets, but they lie in intellectual property in different forms. Patents, trademarks, technologies, trade secrets, and all. Of course, we are going to move into that and look into detail in each type of intellectual property. Then to bring it closer to home, this is the latest publication by Brand Finance, again this year in 2021, looking at the top 10 brands in UAE, with ADNOC leading the position that it also held in 2020. This is the structure of the top 10 brands in the UAE. Now, having said that, let's look into intellectual property, what it is in general. And if I am going to put it in a layman's point of view, intellectual property refers to the creations of the mind, right? And it comes in two branches, where we have industrial property and copyright and neighboring rights. or in some other jurisdictions, it's copyright and related rights. And the focus for me is going to be on industrial property, where we've got patents for the protection of inventions, trademarks for the protection of brand names and logos, industrial designs for the protection of the look and feel of a product. I'm sure we've had experience with different gadgets or different products. Look at the laptops that we use, the mobile phones that we use, the vehicles that we drive. Those industrial designs. Then of course we've got trade secrets, which is that information or organizational information or corporate information that gives an institution or a company a competitive edge over its competitors in the market, and it's always kept secret. The most popular example of the trade secret is the Coca-Cola formula. And then we do have geographical indications, which is another form of intellectual property, more of a community intellectual property, which speaks to the quality of a product on the basis of where it comes from. A very good example is we've got Swiss chocolate, we have champagne from the Champagne region in France, and here we also have Alain water from Alain. So it speaks to a product on the basis of where it comes from. That's a geographical indication. And of course, copyright, where we look at the protection of literary and artistic works, books, music, softwares, images, you name it. That's a copyright where we are looking at protection against reproduction. Now, in terms of overview, this is a snapshot that looks into the main titles of intellectual property that we're going to be discussing today and how they are protected. The most important thing being, what does each protection protect against? And the most important thing is exclusivity, where the law in general doesn't allow a third party to copy your intellectual property, to copy your brand identity, to copy your technology, or to copy your design. So it helps companies and individuals alike from their products being used or being sold or being manufactured by third parties without their consent, without their agreement. And for the purposes of trademarks, the core of trademark is distinction, the distinctive nature of a trademark, where a customer should be able to distinguish between the products and services of company A and products and services for company B. So that when someone gets into, for example, for fast-moving consumer goods, when someone gets into a supermarket, they will be able to distinguish different products on the basis of the trademarks and registered trademarks. So just to get some points in terms of IP protection and how important it is. This is quite an interesting, revelation for some of you guys who are here. In 2012, Apple had to pay $60 million to Profit Technology, which by then was a startup in Shenzhen region of China, just to get the iPad trademark. See, this company, this small startup, had protected and registered the iPad trademark. And China being a bigger market for Apple, they didn't have an option but to pay that amount to secure that trademark, which we normally, advise our clients that whenever you plan to go into a market, it's always important to do the due diligence and make sure that trademark searches are done and you have clearance and you register your trademark before you venture into a market. And the same situation happened to Burger King in Australia. It doesn't go by its name, the popular brand Burger King. It goes by the name Hungry Jack's, because when they got into the Australian market, they found the name Burger King already trademarked by another player, which is something that is important. And we always advise clients, whether small, being a startup or big corporates, when you come up with new services, new technologies, new products, you need to protect your intellectual property. And this image is exactly what, as intellectual property experts, we always don't want our clients to experience. You know, I always say to my clients when I'm presenting, I mean, imagine driving along Shakespeare Road, you see a huge billboard with your logo, and you know that you didn't put up that billboard, and someone is operating using your name. What would you do if you don't have trademark registration? And the biggest challenge is then to stop someone with trademark registration. Now, having talked about trademarks, patents, industrial design, and copyright, the forms of protection are also very important for the audience to understand. For inventions and innovation, we have patents for that protection, and a patent has to be registered, right? And the patent is valid for 20 years. And the idea here is that when you come up with a new technology, there's always that investment in research and development, and you have a time where you have exclusivity so that you recoup the investment in research and development without anyone copying you or anyone benefiting from your research and development. Then we come to industrial designs. Again, they are registered here in the UAE under the patents and the industrial designs law. You need to register, and they're valid for 25 years. And then a trademark, you also need to register your brand name or your logo. And trademark protection is valid for 10 years, where you can then renew after every 10 years. And for copyright, in most countries, registration is actually a formality because copyright exists upon creation. If someone creates a piece of music, create a piece of art, they write a book, they've already created copyright. But however, the UAE has an option for registration where you actually get a certificate of registration for your copyright, which is very important, especially when someone copies or duplicates your work, which in this case is piracy for copyright. When that happens and you do have a certificate of registration, it will be easier to stop them and claim damages when you do have registration. Now, I think for the audience, this is also a question that has always been coming up from clients, and of course, companies, to understand exactly why do we protect intellectual property. And normally, intellectual property is created out of investment in research and development, out of investment in creativity. So what you then need out of that protection is exclusivity, right? So you reduce that risk where people just copy your products without compensation. And obviously, a competitive advantage. The leading companies and the leading organizations in the world, they are very innovative, and with that comes intellectual property protection, where they reduce the likelihood of copying by their competitors, and they become leaders in their markets. Then the most important aspect is enforcement. When you've registered your intellectual property, you have fully secured your ideas, and you'll be able to stop people from copying. You'll be able to stop people from using your ideas. You'll be able to stop people from using logos or brands or trademarks that are similar or confusingly similar to yours, and the law protects you against that. Because the idea, again, of intellectual property is to make sure that there is that distinction, that you are the creator, you invested in that creation, and you should make money out of it. Then finally, encouraging innovation. Surely if research and development was not done, if innovation was not there, things could have been different. Look at the kind of smartphones that we're using now and what was being used in the 80s. There has been a huge leap in terms of improvement and innovation, and that innovation, especially through patents, has been incentivized through protection and exclusivity, which is why that investment in research and development has to be secured, and it's secured through intellectual property protection. So I focused more on trademarks on this slide in terms of what's next in terms of protection, because just for interest's sake, for those who do not know, just in 2020, UAE received trademark applications more than 40,000, both local and abroad applications. So we're looking at more than 40,000, right? And then in terms of technologies, in terms of patents, the figure is quite low, which is 836 patents. So that's why in terms of creating this slide, I focused on the trademark. Now, you've got a new brand name, you've got a new logo, you've got a new product. What's next? What do you do? Number one, the ownership of designs. This is something that we have always come across where there are disputes in terms of ownership. When you outsource, when you engage creators, when you engage contractors, those creative companies, logo designers, software developers, industrial designers, those people, they own the intellectual property rights in their creations. And it's always important that as an organization or as a company, you have an agreement in place that speaks to the ownership of intellectual property. So paying for a service is different from paying for intellectual property ownership or paying for intellectual property rights. If someone designs a logo for you or designs a software for you, and then you pay your 100 dirham, you go, that doesn't mean that you have paid for the intellectual property rights. There should always be an agreement that specifies that the creator has created this software, has created this design, and they've been paid and they've assigned the intellectual property rights to the client, to the one who is paying. It's very important. Then for trademarks, the first point is a trademark search, availability and clearance. What we do is that we do searches to establish that, okay, you want to use this name, is it available? And we also do that even in the markets that you intend to go. We do a search before you get into the market, because there is a risk that is associated with venturing into a market where you don't have trademark protection, because you might actually be infringing on another corporate's trademark in that market. So we need to search and establish that before we create a problem or before we invite a lawsuit. Then after that, when we have the green light, we proceed to registration and we protect trademark in here in UAE or in any other country in the market that you prefer. And another point to note is that intellectual property protection, be it a trademark or patent or design, it's territorial. So when you protect here in UAE, it doesn't mean that you are also protected in Saudi Arabia, you're also protected in Oman. So you need to protect in those different countries. But however, there are other routes and options that can be used for protecting trademarks in more countries. For example, the European Union, you can do one application and cover 27 countries in the EU, excluding the UK. Then there is also the Madrid system, and it's good that the UAE recently acceded to the Madrid protocol, which is a system for international registration of trademarks. And this is actually good news for brand owners in the UAE. So when we are assisting you with trademark registration, we can now, starting from next year, we'll be able to file one application which can be effective in up to 125 territories or 125 countries, which is a good thing, starting first quarter in 2022. Then monitoring and enforcement. When you protect, it doesn't end there. You need to see what is happening in the market and to make sure that no entity is using your brand or a brand that is confusingly similar to yours. And the good part is, you know, the UAE government and of course the Dubai government as well, they are doing really well in terms of making sure that they enforce intellectual property. We've been registering trademarks for our clients on the IP gateway under DED to just make sure that your trademark is safe. And there is cooperation between different players, the police, the customs, to make sure that we do not have infringement happening within the country. And, you know, companies, they benefit from the protection of their intellectual property. Now, having talked about what intellectual property is, the form of protection, trademarks, patents, design, copyright, how then is IP addressed from a strategic point of view, from a policy point of view, is also one question that needs to be addressed. And with that, we are actually looking into the risk that is related to intellectual property and how we can mitigate against that through strategy. So the risk is threefold. When you have your intellectual property, there's a risk for that intellectual property to be infringed by third parties, those who can copy and use your intellectual property without your consent. And there's also a risk whereby when you don't know you have the information, you actually infringe on other parties' intellectual property. And when that happens, you invite lawsuits for your organization or for your company. And then we have internal risk within the organization. I remember at some point we helped a client where they had a challenge with intellectual property theft. They had a challenge with employees leaving with their technologies to start competing businesses. And that is a risk that is also addressed through strategy, that is addressed through what we call institutional or organizational intellectual property policies that will then address those issues. So in terms of strategy, for those in management and in executive management, I mean, we've had strategy sessions where we look at business strategy. But that business strategy from an IP point of view is not complete when it doesn't address intellectual property, when it doesn't address innovation, when it doesn't address how investment in research and development is going to be protected and how it is going to be commercialized. So your intellectual property strategy is a subset of your overall corporate strategy, and it has to be aligned. Besides that, when you, as a company or as an organization, you have your goal or goals, that intellectual property strategy should be aligned with those goals, and it should be tailor-made. So IP strategy is not generic, it's industry specific, it's a market sector specific, and it should suit that industry or market sector. And what we normally do with clients is that we walk with them through the journey of establishing a strategy in line with their vision and mission, and of course how they're going to be protecting the IP, how they're going to commercialize and make money out of the IP, how they are going to implement the strategy, and of course the training for the buy-in and understanding of each and every employee up to the lowest level employee. I've mentioned trade secrets. Sometimes you find that the disposal of documents in an organization might be a huge risk in terms of what information goes out. Some organizations have got trade secret policies that also address shredding of documents, because some of the documents, especially from a research point of view, they carry a lot of important information in terms of intellectual property. So those are the issues that then be addressed in an intellectual property strategy. So this brings me to what I also consider as the most important aspect in terms of intellectual property and how we plan as businesses. And normally our plan looks into the management and operations of an organization or of a company and its growth. And likewise, that plan is not complete when it doesn't address the management, operations, and the growth of intellectual property, where we're looking at how we identify IP within an organization, how do we secure it internally and externally, how do we register it, and where, how do we monitor and enforce. And having done that, how do we make money out of our creativity and innovation through IP protection and commercialization? So a plan without addressing intellectual property is not a complete business plan. We have to address IP, we have to address our creativity, we have to address our innovation. Now, how is IP identified within an organization? Do our employees know what intellectual property is? Do they know when they've created intellectual property? Do you have a policy, or do you have an innovation department that is aware and are monitoring the creative processes of employees, where someone comes up with a new idea, they know that there is this invention disclosure form or IP disclosure form that I'm going to fill in and submit to the innovation department, so that they look at my creation as an employee. So they need to recognize that they're using IP, whether it's IP for the company or external IP, or that they've created it. So the bottom line is they have to be trained to be aware. And our approach as IP experts is that we make organizations IP smart. They are conscious about intellectual property. But how do we do that? Training is the most important thing. Employees need to know what is IP, what form of IP affects my organization and my area of work. And obviously, we always recommend that those training programs should be regular. And as new employees come into the organization, they need to know. And normally this is addressed from a policy point of view. We've done that for different organizations here in the UAE, where we actually create an intellectual property policy for that organization. That policy addresses the ownership of intellectual property, who owns what, when they've created. And normally, intellectual property that is created by employees is owned by the employer, and the law is also quite clear on that. However, there's also a caveat to it. It depends on the form of IP that an employee has created. An employee might be your employee, but the intellectual property that they've created, does it relate to your line of business? Sometimes it doesn't, which those cases makes it owned by the employee. But generally, if an employee creates a new product, a new idea, or new IP, it's owned by the employer, because they would have used the resources of the employer to create that. But if it's outside the scope of the employer's business, it might be owned by that employee. And the other point that I've also mentioned, when you outsource, when you contract service providers, the intellectual property that they create is their own. And when you want your organization to own that intellectual property, there has to be a contract. I mean, just yesterday I was having a conversation at Audit in Abu Dhabi, where there is always that struggle of ownership of intellectual property. We've contracted this software company to develop this software, but however, they claim that they own the intellectual property, or we are developing a software or a technology for a client, and they want the intellectual property, but they are not paying. They think that paying for the service provision is also paying for intellectual property, which is not the case. So in this case, IP has to be secured internally within an organization, and always make sure that appropriate agreements are in place. And the most prudent or the best approach is registration of intellectual property, right? Registration is the best. It gives the owner a comfort in the sense that no one can just use it or copy it without their consent. In the event that someone is researching something and they come up with exactly the same invention, if you have a registration, you always win, or it becomes easier, because most jurisdictions, including here in UAE, they operate under what is called the first to file approach, or the first to file doctrine. The one who files for protection first is the owner of intellectual property. So it's very important. So I move on to the protection and commercializing, which is the interesting part, the dollars and cents of really being innovative of IP protection. So the protection is internal protection, where you are making sure that as an organization, you are protecting your intellectual property internally, confidentiality agreements, restraints upon staff, non-compete agreements. When it comes to speaking about research and development or the efforts that are being made by a company in terms of new products, who does that? Is anyone allowed to just say as a company, we are working on this, we are researching on this, and we are going to have this new product? And because normally that then results in some information which is confidential, leaking and going into the public space. So in terms of commercialization, I talked about strategy and business plan, and that the same plan about management and operations of a business should also address the strategies of making money out of innovation and creativity, of making money out of intellectual property. So this brings us to the ways of commercializing IP. You can use your own intellectual property. You can license your intellectual property and allow others to use that intellectual property for the payment of fees, in this case, the royalty for licensing. And then you can completely sell your intellectual property, and another business can run based on your intellectual property. And just as a continuation, which is exploitation in other terms, commercialization or making money out of IP, there are some strategies that can be used. Dubai is one space where the startup industry really thrives, and intellectual property is also used to raise funds, especially when startups are pitching to investors or even big organizations pitching to investors. IP can actually be valued, and we looked at the different values at the starting of this presentation. So this is also very important for investors and of course for transaction purposes. Licensing, mergers and acquisitions, IP is involved. Then there is exchange of intellectual property, where I give you my IP to get your IP. We might have goals or alignment in terms of industry, in terms of what we're doing. So we can actually use intellectual property to negotiate licensing, where one part get some form of intellectual property. I mean, this is happening, especially in the technology industry, the mobile phone industry, Apple, Samsung, Lenovo, cross-licensing of patents and technologies, screen resolution, processor speed, and all that. So cross-licensing is also a form of a strategy that should be addressed in terms of making money out of intellectual property. Then we have strategic alliances, where companies come together and combine their intellectual property. So basically, aligning IP with the corporate strategy covers a lot of aspects, and I've just included 3 out of the main: research and development strategy, funding, and then marketing strategy. And the first point is quite interesting, because we had a client who invested more than $500,000 dirhams in terms of doing research and development. But because they didn't use patent information, they were technically reinventing the wheel, because the technology that they were creating was already existing in more than 17 patents, and some of them were just existing patents that they could just get information without spending money. So it is always important to consider patent information, to consider intellectual property when you are doing research and development before funding a technology that might be already existing. So it's very important and should be included in the strategy. And most importantly, always engage intellectual property experts during research and development. Some of the research and development is done collaboratively. 2 organizations are coming together. One is bringing expertise, one is bringing funding. Who owns what is going to come out of that research and development, which is joint? IP has to be considered. Agreements have to be put in place when the commercialization stage comes, where we are saying, now we've done the research, we're taking the product to the market, but there are 2 parties who played different roles. So we are always involved to make sure that those agreements are put in place, and individuals and organizations alike, they make money out of intellectual property. So mostly we have seen back in the days the use of tangible assets, the use of land, the use of buildings as collateral, the use of tangible assets for securitization, and the same also apply to intellectual property, which now consists more than 70% of the leading businesses. So it has to be included in every aspect of the business strategy. IP can actually be used as collateral. Patents, trademarks, technologies, they can be used as a collateral for raising money, for raising funds, and for licensing and allowing other players to then use your intellectual property and give money to you. A very good example, we've got big fast food chains here, KFC, McDonald's, Burger King, I've mentioned. They are in numerous countries, but they are not physically there. They have franchises, they are franchising, which means someone is using their intellectual property to make money, and at the same time, they also make money out of that use. So this brings us to the most important point in terms of intellectual property. It's a broad subject, and I've tried to streamline it to make sure that I cover as many aspects as possible. So number one, always make sure that that strategy that you are putting together addresses intellectual property, addresses your creativity, addresses your innovation, right? And for export-oriented firms, before you venture into a market, the due diligence has to be done. IP has to be protected before you are stopped within. We have had clients who have been banned in exporting in certain countries. Why? Because their brand is said to be infringing an already existing brand in that country. So due diligence needs to be done. And we are always there to offer expert advice and, of course, cost-effective protection strategies before you get into the market. And like I said, protection is just the starting point. There is need to make money and generate revenue out of your creativity and innovation. IP needs to be commercialized. The protected IP needs to make money so that you get a return on that investment of the intellectual property that you've created. And enforcement. It won't make sense if you protect your IP, you invest money in protecting IP in different jurisdictions or different markets that you are working on, and you don't enforce, you don't monitor. People can just copy you and make money out of you. But for you to start this whole process, implementing new IP management strategies, implementing new IP policies, there's one important aspect: IP audit. You need to conduct an IP audit, and I will touch that before I'll come to the end of my presentation. So when we do an audit, we are simply casting a huge net upon your organization and capturing everything. What intellectual property do you have? What is it that you own? Do you use licensed intellectual property, by other creators? If you have licensed intellectual property that you have licensed in, do you have the correct agreements in place? What is the value? And what are the risks associated and the means of protection of that IP? So technically, we are just creating a register of all the brands that we have, all the trademarks that we have, all the technologies that we have, all the agreements that we have, and then structuring it in a way that will be able to implement new IP management, will be able to implement new policies and procedures, we will incorporate in your business strategy. So it brings us to the types of intellectual property audit. The most important one that is related to the discussion that we have today is the broad purpose IP audit, where we are looking at everything, intellectual property within an organization, structuring everything and creating a policy for you. Then we have got event-driven IP audit, where we are looking at the type of IP that we have, its value, because there's a transaction that is coming, there's a takeover that is coming, there's a merger or an acquisition, and probably assignment. We then need to establish that value to be included as part of that transaction. And the last one is the limited purpose, where you might receive a lawsuit that you are infringing on IP and there's litigation coming. You also need to do an audit to prepare for that litigation and to prepare yourself to protect and defend yourself. Those are the types of IP audit, which brings me to some of the IP topics that we do have that are approved by the Knowledge and Human Development Authority, which we offer in partnership with the Binman Academy. We've got more than 17 that target executive management, board members, senior management, and general employees. So having said that, and of course, in view of time, I would invite Doa to throw in any questions that we might have had during the course of the presentation. Doa, if you can hear me, you can go ahead and we can answer questions in view of time. Thank you very much. So Doa, if you are there, we can move on to the discussion part of it. If you've captured any questions, I will be happy to answer those questions before the end of the presentation.
Well, I am waiting. If someone interested to drop a question in the section of Q&A, please.
Yeah, possibly you might have those who want to ask instead of just typing. It will be good to hear from the audience and answer questions in terms of what they would require answered.
So far, no one wrote any comments for the time being.
All right, no.
Yeah, there is.
Okay, fine. Yeah, we do have. Okay, someone is requesting to share
the contact number.
The contact screen.
Yeah.
The contact screen is shared. And then there is another question. Someone says, I have copyright application in Dubai and need to go forward to commercialization. So what I would probably need to understand is what is it exactly that you have protected or applied for under copyright, and then we can obviously discuss now the commercialization strategy, where how you can make money out of that. We've got a client who developed kids cartoons. They've got a logo, they've got a trademark, and then they have the copyright in terms of the characters that they've created in the cartoon, and we are helping them with the protection and of course the commercialization part, where other corporates are coming in and they want to use that content, and we then end up having a licensing agreement. So I would need to understand more on your copyright application that you have, and then we can see how you can move from protection to commercialization. That is the dollars and cents of your intellectual property. So Doa, if you can take note, Raja has shared the email address there.
Yeah, he shared his email address.
Yes, if you can take note of that. Then we've got another one. Once we obtain IP later, if we make changes again, we have to start like fresh. So what I want to know is what kind of IP are we talking about? If you have registered a trademark, a trademark by law is required to be used as registered. So when you've registered a trademark or your logo, when you change or when you rebrand, that rebrand becomes different from your existing trademark. So you have to register that as a new trademark.
Ms. Lobna,
let me know if you've been answered.
Yeah, Ms. Lobna is asking if we could be able to share the presentation or the slides that you just presented right now. And also she's asking if is the technical manuals are to be registered like IP?
So the technical manual, yes, it's intellectual property, that's copyright. So if I'm going to give you an example, let's say you buy a phone, a mobile phone in a box. The phone has got a name, maybe Samsung, Apple, MI, that's a trademark. The shape of the phone, that mobile phone, that's an industrial design. The manual of the phone or the technical specifications, that's copyright. The technology that is inside the mobile phone, it's protected by patents. Then there are what are called integrated circuits. Those small items you see within a phone or within a laptop, it's all intellectual property combined together. So your mobile phone or your laptop carries the whole bunch of intellectual property, and it's all protected. So I've just confirmed here that the slides will be shared.
Okay, Mr. Juma Al-Mutawa, if a company put on shelf system and contributed in developing it, making it far better version, is the company in position that allow it to apply for obtaining IP for the new version of the system?
Yes, that's possible, but however, it depends on the existing agreement, because from what this listener is saying, they've improved. So that improvement on its own, it warrants intellectual property protection, but it depends on the existing agreement. We also have what are called improvement patterns, where you actually improve on an existing technology and make it better. So when you do that, you are actually creating something new, and it can be protected as intellectual property.
Also, Ms. We have a question from Hudan Hassan, asking if we have supported manufacturing company improve the design of a product. Will that be considered IP?
Yes, this is design improvement, which means that product already had an existing design, not knowing if the existing design was registered and protected. So this new design or this new improvement, if it meets the requirements that it's completely new, it has been not used in the market, it can still be protected as a new design, because you improved, and in the improvement process, you actually created a new design. So normally we do a design search to search and establish that this is a completely new design, and we recommend for you that you can actually protect this design and no one can use it and no one can copy it. So that was for Hudan Hassan. That improvement is actually a new intellectual property that you've created. But to be sure, we then do an industrial design search, and then we can tell you that, okay, you can go ahead and also protect that new design.
So, so far, there is no other questions. Who would love to share any questions? You can send it to info@dqg.org, and definitely we'll forward it to Mr. Simba to answer it and be in touch with you. The presentation will be able to share it to the attendees, and this webinar will be displayed on our YouTube channel for Dubai Quality Group. Thank you so much, Mr. Simba, for giving us this opportunity and giving a lot of your time today. Looking forward to seeing you in the upcoming webinars.
Thank you so much, Doa. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you for the questions as well.
Thank you. Thank you for attendance. Good night.